All right, welcome to the Yeoman Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Graham. On Yeoman, we talk with people who build and grow things, people who create art, and people who think and write about community, meaning, and purpose. I am with such a person this morning. This is my brother and business partner, Vince Graham. Vince, welcome to Yeoman.
Jeff, my pleasure. I'm honored to be here.
Yeah. Well, this is a long time coming. I'm glad we are able to be together and do this together. We're recording from Mugdock Castle on Sullivan's Island, almost immediately next to Fort Moultrie. And Vince has had this home now for how long?
I bought it in 2002, renovated it, and moved in 2004, and then added on to it 15 years ago. And it's been mostly a rental property, but we're doing some work out here. And I'm living here while manage the subs.
It's a rather unremarkable building, just kind of your typical everyday beach castle.
That's right. Small beach castle.
Yeah. This is, we are in the Winter Hall right now. Is that right?
That's right. It was this chapel. It was originally built as the chapel, the Church of the Holy Cross, Episcopal Church in 1891. And in 1906, the aggressive Department of Defense took it through eminent domain as their post chapel. And so the church went 2 miles away and built a new church. Mm-hmm. And I'm a member of that church. And the church was used, a little bit of history, it was used by the Fort Moultrie, which was still an active Army base until after World War II. Then it was decommissioned. The Lutheran Church purchased it. They used it to the 70s, and it was sold as a house. Mm-hmm. So I bought it with the intent to move it to Ion and make it back into a church. But that was thwarted by the town of Sullivan's Island, and so ended up turning into a beach castle.
Yeah. Took a big renovation, and then that's been an ongoing. You've been largely finished, though, aside from kind of maintenance and little improvements here for 10 years.
Yeah, there's always something to do. It's been a fun project. I call it my exercise in architectural eccentricity. Mm-hmm. You know, this part of it that we're sitting in has these beautiful old world, 2-foot thick granite walls. Been really fortunate to work with a lot of craftspeople who've thrown their hearts into renovating it and then adding on to it.
Well, I will link to, there's a website, lots of pictures on it. I'll link to those in the show notes. Y'all should check it out. And I'd say, like, you got the castle, you're renovating it pretty much, I think, done with the first renovation when my first child was born, Alex. Mm-hmm. And so our kids have sort of grown up coming down to visit their uncle and thinking it was kind of normal for people to have uncles who had beach castles, mm-hmm. shoot cannons from the turret.
Right.
That was just kind of a normal everyday thing. And it wasn't until they were older that they began to appreciate that, maybe this is not a normal thing. Mm-hmm. But my daughter and a friend of hers are coming down, hopefully. I think I'm going to jump in the pool some.
Yeah,
next week can play. So Vince and I have been brothers for all my life, and business partners now for well over 2 decades, probably about 25 years. I'd say since maybe 1998, 97. I don't know that I can't remember exactly when I became a partner in the Ion company, but we've been working together since, in some capacity since I was a teenager.
You were a general manager on the little Broad Street project.
That's right. Yeah. So I was
in Beaufort.
Yeah, that's right. Long time ago. Mm-hmm. And that was in 1996, 95, 96.
Was that your first real job after Davidson?
It was I worked construction all through, in the field, construction all through most of high school and all through college. So that was my first kind of salaried job, was to work as the general manager for a little partnership in Beaufort that Vince was part of, and 4 other entrepreneurs
It's Paul Trask, Merritt Patterson,
Monty Jones.
Monty Jones. Just those.
Oh, yeah. I thought we had one more.
Henry Lyon.
Henry Lyon, yeah.
Was he? I don't know.
He was. Did he sell out of that partnership when he moved back to Atlanta?
I think so.
Yes, he may have exited, but he was there for a little while. But that was our first kind of professional working relationship.
Which is a cool project. Have you been back there? It's really
I haven't been back to Beaufort in forever. Yeah, we actually have a bunch of Beaufort listeners. So y'all go check out Broad Street.
It's in the Mossy Oaks neighborhood of Beaufort. It's a little infill. It's about
11 acres.
11 acres.
Yeah, so big infill. I mean, there's a big piece of property for that little area.
Adjacent to Mossy Oaks Elementary.
53 home sites, something like that.
I think that's right.
Yeah. Very first. So Vince is good at this. He'll deflect to me, but that was kind of my first sort of general management role, and built a couple houses. At that point, we were going through the rezoning process for Ion in Mount Pleasant, and I left that job with Broad Street and then came up to help with the development of Ion when it looked like we were sort of right on the cusp of getting our approvals and needing to do some serious work. But we've worked together, and I would say in a really, like, you hear a lot of horror stories about family working together, and certainly it's not without its challenges, but like, I think we've done pretty well with that so far.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And we've done everything from the design to working on the documents for homeowners associations, and we've had our disagreements, but for the most part, it's been constructive.
Yeah. I mean, some really big disagreements. It never got acrimonious. Generally, with the passage of time, it always turns out that I was right about them. But you've been real gracious in acknowledging that. So it's
acknowledging that you're right.
Yeah.
Partly right.
Sometimes. Maybe we can talk about HOAs as we get a little further into this.
Oh, yeah.
So
that might be something to put in the show notes, if we can link to that long ago discussion of governance.
Yeah.
Which we definitely should have done that direction, what we were talking about.
So among the jobs that many real estate developers have, among the responsibilities that many of them have, particularly if they're building a larger project, and generally too, if you expect to be selling to buyers from outside of state, you're effectively obligated to create a homeowners association, which is really kind of like you're drafting a constitution and you're creating a government that's going to persist well after you're gone, or almost certainly will persist well after you're gone. And so generally that's sort of something a developer will abdicate to an attorney who specializes in that sort of thing, and you'll get the perfunctory template document. So we'll probably get into the importance of how you can establish culture through the creation of something like that, and how the rules that you set up to govern your place have huge implications over time. Where I'd like to start, though, and we'll link to some stuff about Ion too, so you can see it if you're not at all familiar with that neighborhood. But where I would like to start, so it's been a great experience working together over the years, and also getting to build some things or have a role in the building of things. It was honestly very much a many hands make light work type project. But when friends or colleagues or just anybody generally comes through the neighborhood and knows me at all, or I imagine you get this as well, they know that it took a lot of doing to gain permission to build that neighborhood. And a question people ask is like, why would anyone ever not want something like this to be built? The neighborhood's been successful. It's beautiful. People really love living there. And tends to be people who are not super familiar with how real estate development works or how things get built are amazed that you just can't go out and do stuff like that. And I find myself struggling to give a concise answer. And I tend to default by saying something like, oh, well, it's largely illegal to build places like this, just to go out and do it. And everyone's unsatisfied with that answer, and I'm unsatisfied with it as well, because there's more to it than that. But I think it's important to explore that question, and that's one of the things I'd like to talk to you about there. So when people ask you that question, because I'm sure they do, how do you respond to it?
Well, it is a challenge, as you say, to come up with just kind of a simple, elevator speech for how it came about. And the fact that zoning effectively outlaws it is a contributing factor. That our policies tend to subsidize the alternative approach, kind of the sprawling area. And developers are like any business people. They want to make money, and the easiest path to that is to, or it has been for decades and decades, is to go out and buy land at the periphery where there is not any kind of opposition to development, and develop infrastructure in a conventional way and sell the lots to production home builders. And so since, after World War II, that's been the predominant land use pattern, just because it's easier to do. It's legal.
Yeah.
And our government subsidized the roads out into the countryside. So, but that's also, I think, Jeff, we can get into the cultural and the social and even the spiritual aspects of it. It's been said that politics follows culture, and I think that culture follows the environment to some extent. So we have this kind of situation where, the meta narrative is that people are bad and more people are worse. So we need to spread them out, and the more they're spread out, the more they're suspicious of the traditional way of building and developing. So,
a thing that I don't think I was really appreciative of, or I didn't fully appreciate early on in my career, but maybe I become fixated on it now, is all these forces of atomization that break apart our communities, make us suspicious of one another, make us less likely to care about the well-being of those people that are live nearby or in our neighborhood or whatever. And having a role in building communities has helped highlight how there's so many forces that are pushing for atomization that it takes an enormous amount of work to battle against. And you highlighted a few there, like zoning. It's, and developers do need to make money, so the thing to do is to go build where the cows don't vote and sell a product to something that people will drive till they qualify for.
Right.
And there's a lot of pressure to house people. We do have kind of relative shortage of housing. A lot of places worse than others. So I don't begrudge the developers too much of going out and doing it, because it is really hard to battle against all those forces. When do you think when did that start? When did that people are bad, more people are worse kind of thing begin, and what does it come from?
Well, I think the 20th century was largely an age of fear and things that happened, the terrible consequences in the World War I and II, and then the fear of change and fear of women in the workforce, or the fear of blacks, or the fear of the other. And I think there were some, so we kind of institutionalize that fear in our codes, our zoning codes, for example. And I'm sure there are some, I'm not sure of it, there are some things that happened in the 18th and 19th century that led up to that, which we can talk to. But I think, example, I just want to share that one of the insights I had when I moved to Beaufort in 1989 to work for the developers of Spring Island, their concept was 500 5-acre lots on this beautiful 3,000-acre island. And Spring Island was right in between Beaufort, which is the second oldest city in South Carolina, and Hilton Head, which was developed more in a suburban fashion in the 50s. And people would move from, or most of our interested prospects were from Hilton Head. And they would always come and say, oh, Hilton Head used to be nice till all these people moved here. Mm-hmm. And that was in contrast to Beaufort, where I moved and bought an old house, and everybody welcomed you in. And so there was this kind of fear thy neighbor versus love thy neighbor. And that was the realization that if what you offer is privacy and exclusivity, then every time a house gets built, it takes away from what you're originally offering, as opposed to with a different narrative. Every time a house gets built, you add to what's being offered, so it gets better over time, theoretically, than worse. So there's other factors.
Do you think the fear of what a new neighbor might bring or what a new building might do to a place, do you think that preceded the kind of all the rules and regulations or incentives or whatever that has led to our built environment, or do you think it came after that?
It's hard to say, this kind of chicken and egg. I think they both fed into the dynamic.
I think there was it goes back to really the really early, the 1700s, but I think that lately I'm thinking it stems from this sort of global, nationalism movement that kind of really took up steam in Prussia. And as the industrialization began, people saw the power of mechanization and came to believe that mechanizing things was the path forward, and that organic, evolving things was not, things needed to be planned. They needed to have an architect of them. And so governments began to, that was when sort of nationalism became a thing. You used to associate with your region or your community or whatever, and you actually might not even have really known or paid any attention to or had much of a relationship to your ultimate ruler there. And I think that mentality started to seep all over the world, and it evolved into what we see now as central planning. And this in a top-down imposition of how things ought to be, which is like this sort of grasping to be like God, and it's totally futile, and you're always going to screw it up. And then when you screw things up, you screw it up on a really giant scale, right? You screw up your whole landscape, or you screw up your whole energy system, or whatever. It's my kind of maybe last 5-year jag. I've been sort of fixating on that thing.
Well, I think you're right, and that accelerated again in the 19th and 20th century, that tendency to consolidate and have this kind of economy of scale. Well, we just have things bigger and better, and have a kind of the industrialized mindset that was embraced. And it was embraced in, obvious 19th century examples, Germany, where it consolidated into one big country, Italy, and the United States at the same time. Prior to that, you had some of that in like the UK was that way too, but that preceded those other places. But yeah, it's this kind of mechanization that you talk about, this industrialized mindset that bigger is better, and that's what happened.
Well, something I loved, a theme I like to explore with this podcast, Yeoman, the theme, and you brought it up as a quote. I'll let you read it early on. I'll let you read it rather than me reading it. But the idea that we want, rather than what I'd love to see, and I think we are in a time of turning where, the trend is your friend and we're seeing things change, but like our society, our culture, our civilization should be about creating opportunity for individuals rather than prescribing a plan for them. Mm-hmm. And we've been in maybe a couple hundred years of accreting plan prescription, and it's been painful to us. And now it's time to. I think we're beginning to move back into this period of recognizing how important it is for individuals to have autonomy and opportunity.
Yeah, that's the hope, right? And that's our hope. And awareness is the first step. So just to recognize the downside of this kind of centralizing approach and the alternatives could be.
Yeah.
Is good. I mean, the quote you mentioned, Alcaeus Alcaeus of Mytilene was an ancient Greek poet. And talking about cities, he said, not houses finely roofed, nor the stones of walls well built, nor canals and dockyards make the city, but men able to use their opportunity. And the way we've been building, it's like the policies and procedures and the meta narrative, we don't enable opportunity, or the opportunities that we do enable are, driving an Uber car or some kind of transport. It's not going in and building, beautiful ironwork or masonry. It's so most of the population, at least in the U.S., is engaged in, not most of it, but a large amount of it is just engaged in moving people around.
Yeah.
And that's that's another quote that I've talked about. The origins of this is from Corbusier, who said in the 30s, he said, "The cities will be part of the country. I shall live 30 miles from my office in one direction under a pine tree. My secretary 30 miles away from it too, in the other direction under another pine tree. We shall both have our own car. We shall use up tires, wear out road services and gears, consume oil and gasoline, all of which will necessitate a great deal of work, enough for all." So that pretty much describes the vision of the built environment.
What year did he say that?
He wrote it in the Radiant City.
Yeah.
And it was, I'm not sure when it was put in English. I want to say in the 40s, but he wrote that in the early 30s.
Yeah.
In France.
So look, Corbu, the crow, he actually gave himself that name. Mm-hmm. He's in the picture of him, he's the perfect villain of modernity. And he was total fascist, big fan of Hitler. And still to this day celebrated among architecture academics as a great contributor to things. You got to hand it to him, though. He's pretty successful.
Yeah.
Do you have handy, Vince? A great thing, one of the many things I love about my brother is he carries around infinite quotes. Things that
I'm a geeky quote collector.
Do you have handy the Brave New World quote from Mustafa Aman talking about consumption of?
Of course, I have that.
So you had Corbusier in roughly 1930 saying that, and Brave New World was what, maybe 47?
1932.
Oh, 1932. So right around that same time. My golfer friends don't like this quote, by the way.
So toward the beginning of the book, there are these young alphas. Remember in the book, there's a caste system, and you have alphas and betas and epsilons and deltas, and the alphas are the thinkers, and the epsilons are just kind of the grunt workers. And there's a tour of the Hatcheries and Conditioning Center. And the director of the Hatcheries and Conditioning Center is leading this tour. And there's a quote in there, and this is, just further context, Huxley is one of the things he's writing about. He's observing just conditions at the time and kind of the rise of consumerism and things like that. So it says, a love of nature keeps no factories busy. It was decided to abolish the love of nature, at any rate among the lower classes, to abolish the love of nature, but not the tendency to consume transport. For of course, it was essential that they should keep on going to the country even though they hated it. The problem was to find an economically sounder reason for consuming transport than a mere affection for primroses and landscapes. It was duly found. We conditioned the masses to hate the country, concluded the director, but simultaneously we conditioned them to love all country sports, meaning golf, which was on the rise then. At the same time, we see to it that all country sports shall entail the use of elaborate apparatus so that they consume manufactured articles as well as transport. I see, said the student, and was silent, lost in admiration.
Yeah. I mean, Corbusier could have written that same quote.
Right. Well, that was what was Huxley's genius, who just observed things and project them forward.
So brilliant. I love, there's a great, maybe I'll link to it too, or if I can find it, there's a great comic, which you may have seen, saying who was right, was it Orwell or Huxley? And they certainly have, painfully, they were both right about a lot of things, but Huxley seems to have been the most prescient.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
Well, there are a lot of forces that have been it's not just in the built environment. So when I started thinking about atomization and the elimination of paths toward opportunity, the closing of doors for people, I was really thinking about it with regard to the built environment, transportation policy, zoning, those sorts of things. But we see it kind of almost, if you look at any illness of modernity, if you scratch it enough, you're going to come across something similar. Like in the last decade or so, I've been real interested in agriculture. I think urbanists, this is not across the board, many urbanists are totally aware of both these things, but generally speaking, I think urbanists do not pay enough attention to the other side of the coin. There's many sides probably, but the other side, which is agriculture. And just as in urbanism, we had our Corbusier and we had our Robert Moses, and we had our construction of the interstate highway system, whatever. The same things happen in agriculture as well, and largely around following the World War II. And it was in this sort of get big or get out, Earl Butz sort of industrial. We need to industrialize the agriculture system to make it controllable, plannable, and predictable, and commoditizable and financializable. And so here we are. But I'd say all this to lead to the point that I'm optimistic about it, because when we started working together at ION, the whole notion, even among urbanists, that maybe zoning was the problem, that was like, nobody was saying that back then. It was greedy developers who were causing all those problems. Mm-hmm. And now it's become almost conventional wisdom that zoning is the problem. And you see states as different as California and Montana trying to, in the ways they can, reverse the damage that was probably started by the Supreme Court with regard to property rights. So that to me is pretty optimistic. Like, barely even 5 years ago were people talking about this, and even people, policy advisors in this area who saw the problem for what it was, were never thought we'd be seeing as much reform, good reform, as is happening right now. So I'm pretty optimistic about it. But I feel like when we get together, we tend to get kind of down in the dumps, point at all the negative things.
Maybe, but I think to your point, it has changed dramatically since we started in business together, and people are more aware. They tend to be aware of that the zoning side of things, and as you've talked with Charlie Gardner and others, I think it's that in combination with this transportation subsidies that really, and that's another the cases as I've heard you talk about before with the Supreme Court decision, 1907 decision in Wilson versus Shaw, where the court empowered Congress to fund infrastructure at the federal level. And so it's all these different forces, cultural, social, governmental, but I think this that's a big linchpin that needs more
transportation
focus.
Policy. Yeah. I think more recently too, you studied economics in school, didn't you? I'm not articulate enough to talk about economic policy in any intelligent way, but my increasing sense is that below those things, or preceding those things, we have monetary policy that is enabling a lot of this as well. Probably could go a little bit wonky in that, or down some
wonky.
details. Yeah. Maybe a good direction to take it is some reasons for some things that we're seeing that give you a lot of optimism about the future of our built environment, and some things that are harder than ever about building. We've often said that when people ask, where would you do the next ion? And it's hard to answer that question. Ion, for context, it gets referenced a few times in this podcast, but it's 244 acre infill piece of property in Mount Pleasant, very close to the bridge to Charleston. 762 home sites, retail, commercial, schools, all kinds of things, very walkable place. It has been a successful project for us, very successful for the builders and architects who've been involved in it. And I think, I would say the residents, both original and current, there's been a lot of turnover in the over 25 years since we started, would say really great things about it. All in all, successful for all parties. And one would look at that and say, well, clearly you should be building more places like that, but it's not that easy. How are we able to do it then? And what would be making it harder to do that today?
Well, we were able to do it then. We were really fortunate at the time to have had the experience with New Point and Broad Street and places like that to point to it. The town of Mount Pleasant, where Ion is located, had a written master plan that had been prepared in the years leading up to us coming on the scene, that spoke about the virtues of the traditional building patterns, pointing specifically to what's called today the Old Village of Mount Pleasant, which is a historic 300-acre mixed-use town on the eastern shore of Charleston Harbor. And there was a lot of citizens and political leadership had been involved in that master plan, and it actually named specifically several sites in Mount Pleasant that would be ideal to build such a pattern again, and one of them was the site where Ion is located. So, but the problem with the master plan is the zoning was not consistent, as you remember. So we had to go through a rezoning process to get that, and it was, the what people see today in Ion is to let your listeners know, it was a vastly compromised version of what we originally saw, with more commercial, triple the amount of commercial space, multifamily, all kind of different uses. And so we had to scale that back in an effort to ultimately get approval from the town council. So it's just only single family detached and relatively low density. And we did have the flexibility to create these beautiful spaces, but we were limited. And after that, after we got approved, shortly after, the opponents to the neighborhood were able to galvanize their political forces and vote out all the council members who had supported the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. So we were dealing with the hostile political environment throughout most of the time we were developing Ion. And that political environment continues to be hostile to any form of innovation and development. There's been periods where they, like after the recession, they would change their mind and allow a little more flexibility. And, Earl's Court is one of the neighborhoods that I was involved in building right at the edge of the old village in Mount Pleasant. But once we started, we had this kind of NIMBY blowback. And so even though Earl's Court is another example of very successful development, mixed use and very dense, 10 times the density of Ion, mm-hmm. The political blowback, again, prohibited that from ever being built again. So at least in that little microcosm of development, regional development, it's just the forces are hostile.
Has there been, I mean, you probably don't know, but I don't either. I'm wondering if there has been a successful rezoning of an infill piece of property that is, over 50 acres in the last 10 years anywhere in the country. Surely there has been.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure there have been. But it's just mostly a battle.
Can you think of any?
Well, there's places where Kobe's doing his project in Kingston, where they've changed the zoning to enable it.
Yeah, I was thinking those are the places where it's happened, where there have been citywide or municipality-wide upzonings of properties that have eliminated exclusionary zoning restrictions and enabled something like what Kobe's project. We'll link to that as well. Y'all should check. Kobe's maybe like the fourth or so guest on Yeoman. But I'm trying to think of one where a developer, without a developer has sought and received a rezoning. I know Charles Brewer and his team at Green Street were successful in Atlanta with the rezoning of Glenwood Park. And that was around 2004, maybe something like that, 2002, 2004. I'm trying to think if in the internet, the social media era, if a developer has been able to prevail in a large scale rezoning.
What's the project in Orlando, the old Navy base there that the name escapes me, that the guys from Celebration.
I know what you're talking about. I can't remember.
It's beautifully done.
They got their entitlements for that a long time ago, didn't they? That's not a...
Well, I'm just trying to think of an example of where rezoning was successful, and they had the backing of folks.
Yeah.
Just like we had the backing.
We had a lot of support, yeah.
The forces of doom against us, but we had tremendous support, which is how we got it zoned. But, there are little examples. Cat Fiddle Street downtown, Reed Burgess loved that, and that was, so it had to be rezoned to a plan developed to get that. So
my sense is, and I don't know the politics of Charleston at all, but my sense is there's not any like that. There's no real antagonism or opposition toward Cat Fiddle. Do you have that? Is that accurate? This is another cool project. These are a bunch of cool projects.
Well, there was.
There was?
Yeah. They were fortunate to Cap Fiddle, Reed, and George Holt, and others who were involved in that. Tim Keene was the director of planning at Charleston at the time, and he kind of ran interference for the kind of lower level bureaucrats who didn't want anything to change, who wanted to keep it the same. And I think Tim is one of those rare individuals. There are many around the country who, back to the Alcaeus quote, they want to create opportunity for cool things to happen. And that's unusual because, the inertia of the politics and bureaucracy just want to keep status quo.
Tim Keene was the planning commissioner in Charleston till maybe like 2007 or so, somewhere around there.
No, later than that. He left shortly after Riley stepped down, so that was maybe 10 years ago.
Okay.
And then he went to Atlanta.
Then he came to Atlanta, and I think was incredibly successful in some regards in Atlanta of beginning a widespread sort of appreciation that many of Atlanta's challenges are a product of terrible land use policy and trying to change this. But he also met with enormous resistance and did not have within the I don't know that the mayor he came in under, Kasim Reed, was generally supportive, but it wasn't his main area of focus, whereas Riley was kind of famous for being interested in the built environment. He didn't have any real political backing in Atlanta, and so it was very hard for him to advance an agenda in Atlanta, and he's left and is now planning commissioner in Boise. Is that
Actually,
right?
He's back in Charleston. We
really?
talked about this.
No.
Yeah.
Breaking news.
He went to Boise and helped rejigger and redo their whole zoning, and then he went to Calgary, and then very recently, our new mayor in Charleston, William Cogswell, hired Tim back. So he's back here in Charleston.
Oh, wow. That's great.
So also with Josh Martin, who was also hired back. So we have some really innovative leadership.
And impressive hair, too.
Tim has really good hair. Yeah, there's, I think, websites devoted to it.
Yeah.
At least there was in Atlanta.
I mean, and I don't want to take away from Josh's hair either. He's pretty striking hair.
Good hair game in Charleston, planning department.
Not among the developers.
No. At least not this one.
Well, that's exciting news. So to a little more background on Tim, it's unusual, though I think increasingly, I think younger people who enter the planning profession and are seeking opportunities in the public sector are much more a reason for optimism, I would say, are much more of the thinking of Tim. Tim is pretty ahead of his time and sort of seeing that part of the planning department's function should be to enable opportunity rather than prescribe land use.
That's right. And that's why I say he's rare in that people in that position. It's just much easier to do the same old thing, as innovation involves subverting the status quo. So much easier just to keep on going. But
what's
Tim
the quote
is
about?
Courageous, and he wants to see something better.
Yeah. Well, that's exciting, and hopefully that present more opportunity to see him than being in Boise. And in Calgary, though, I'd heard he'd been doing good work in those places.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah. Or in Boise, I hadn't heard anything about Calgary. Well, that's great. How did I get onto that? On Cat Fiddle. So he had kind of, the Reed and the team developing the group involved in that development had sort of encouragement, support, and flight cover from leadership within the city.
Right. And as well as some of the neighbors.
Yeah.
I mean, they were willing to go out on a limb and work to support it and get it through. But then some people still resent it, just like some people still resent ION. How could they allow it? And I think places like, it's ironic, right? Because basically what we're doing is taking lessons learned from these historical places and trying to combine those with modern advances and build them new ones. But it's such a departure from the conventional of the last 60, 70, 100 years. And it's the, Upton Sinclair, hard to get a man to understand something of his salary depends upon him not understanding it. And we were challenging the kind of paradigm of the conventional planning set. And some people who spent their life engaged in that.
Yeah.
And they can't, it takes a big heart to say, well, maybe I wasn't right.
Yeah, I mean, some of our, dwell on these difficulties too much, but some of our most passionate opponents in our development plans for ION were, not going to say any names, some of them passed away now, but were people who, worked as, civil engineers or retired people who'd been heavily involved in creating the prescriptions that developers must comply with now.
Right.
And to even imagine that they might have been doing wrong in the world it's hard for someone to wrap their head around.
Mm-hmm. Can't admit it.
Yeah. I do so as a reason for optimism, though, and I kind of link this to Tim. I think Tim is I don't know how old Tim is, maybe somewhere
probably
between our
50s,
age. Yeah. I think Tim is rare for people in his profession of his age. And I think he is closer to the norm of people who are in their early 20s and pursuing the kind of career that he has now in terms of the worldview. That's my gut.
Well, I hope you're right. And that does seem to be like some of the places you cited in Montana and other places, Boise, Calgary, that are really taking measures, and lots of cities.
The secondary and tertiary markets, a lot of these little towns who, they tend to have younger people who are less advanced in their career, in these staff positions. And they're encouraging infill, mixed use, walkable.
Right.
I hear some young in Kingston, New York would be an example of that, like where Kobe's working, or your other developers talk about how much support they have from their planning departments and mayors or city councils, where that's just kind of practically unheard of back in the day.
Yeah.
First time I ever had exposure to sort of support from that was a project I was not really involved with, but you were much more involved with in North Augusta for Hammond's Ferry, where the city of North Augusta was like, hey, we want to do some really great things, sort of reaching out, trying to pull experienced developers in to build cool things. It's just...
Yeah, it's gets down to leadership and a willingness to be open to alternatives.
Yeah.
That's what we had in Mount Pleasant with ION at the time.
Yeah.
And all these other places we've been talking about. I guess I don't get down, but I think the system in general is almost like a totalitarian system that has institutionalized fear of the other and sprawl. So I think the easiest and best thing that could be done is just to stop subsidizing this. Stop subsidizing, especially at the federal level.
Yeah.
Return to the original, what the framers decided at the Constitution, that Congress would not have that power to fund infrastructure.
So let's talk about that a little bit, and then I wanted to ask you how you describe your job to people. Mm-hmm. But I do want to spend some time on the whole topic of internal improvements, because I think it's underappreciated how. So set us up. So the Constitutional Convention, there's a lot of debate about what powers the federal government ought to have and what it should not have. Among the enormous debates was whether or not the U.S. government should be in the business of building interstate highways.
Well, I don't think that was the debate in 1787. They didn't know about interstate highways, but
Pretty much so.
Yeah, it was
Canals.
canals
Yeah.
is what they were.
And discussion of post roads. Is that someone that should we stop? Someone knocking on your door.
I don't think so.
So this is a little bit of an interruption. Mugdock Castle's pretty cool. So people visit Sullivan's Island, you should drive down to Fort Moultrie and you'll drive right by it and you'll be like, whoa, that's something different. But people are regularly trying to come into this place because they think it's, a historic building that's on the tour. So, call up Vince if he's generally generous about that. If he doesn't have any people in here, he'll show it to you, but don't just walk in.
Yeah, that's we do get lots of knocks on the door here.
When I was coming over yesterday, there were some people coming into the open. You could tell they weren't sure if they should go in. They were opening up your garden door, and they were like, "This looks like it's too cool to not be a historic thing that's open to the public. So should I go in? Should I not?" They ultimately decided not.
Previous tenants had put a private residence on the gate.
Yeah,
maybe I need to put that back up.
So canals, post roads, things like that.
Yeah, so we can go deep in this history, and I've spent a lot of time reading about it, studying it. The canal craze that started in England in the 18th century jumped over the Atlantic, and a lot of individuals who became involved in framing the Constitution were in the development business, speculating in Western land development, and wanted to build transportation conduits from the area east of the eastern continental divide to the west to enable connection. And those people included George Washington,
Ben Franklin,
and John Rutledge, who was South Carolina's first president and first governor. And after the Revolutionary War, Washington has probably been the most documented. He had long wanted, he had acquired all this land in the Ohio River Valley and had long sought to create a highway, if you will, between the headwaters of the Potomac and the headwaters of the Ohio River, to ultimately create a watery network between the Potomac and the Ohio to the Mississippi to the Gulf Coast. They kind of see that big picture. He basically would just what DeWitt Clinton did with the Erie Canal in New York decades later. That's what Washington wanted to do. And most people think that he'd given up his command of the armed forces, that he just retired to Mount Vernon. Well, he didn't do that. He immediately started a company called the Potomac Company to connect the headwaters of the Potomac to the Ohio River. And the company very quickly got in trouble, underfunded. It's taking too long, much more difficult than they had thought. And they tried to get bailouts from Maryland and Virginia, which were also partners in that company, and that didn't work. So I contend that ultimately the Annapolis Convention that preceded the Philadelphia Convention was an effort for Washington to get a bailout from the other states, and there was a lot of support for that from those who were involved in the canal business in Pennsylvania and Virginia, but not South Carolina, which was also John Rutledge had with William Moultrie. You mentioned Fort Moultrie down the street. They were the vice president and president of the Santee Canal Company to build a canal, but they didn't think it was appropriate for the federal government to subsidize canals. So that was an issue during this that came up a couple of times during the convention about this funding infrastructure, and was shut down ultimately in September 14th, 1787, the big debate where this came up. Franklin had proposed that Congress be empowered to fund canals, and it was pushback from the smaller states. Back then, the division wasn't north-south. It was big states, small states. And the small states didn't want to subsidize infrastructure that would benefit those states. And so they pushed back. And that was in a vote. They voted 8 states to 3 against this power.
And they were explicit in the reasoning why. Like it was not, as I recall reading that, it was not appropriate for someone to be compelled to pay for infrastructure that they neither wanted or would not use.
That's right. They thought that was a bad idea.
And if that started, you would end up with this arms race for everybody wanting to get that money to use in your own area. So you just spread around all this giant spending, and infrastructure would get built all over the place that under the guise of the public good, but it wouldn't really be that way.
Right. Yeah, so that it was decided at the Constitutional Convention to not so empower Congress. But over the next 80 years or so, there were efforts still to kind of go back in and Congress to pass bills to fund infrastructure in their various states. And during most of that period, there were about between Washington's time and Buchanan's time, there were 51 presidential vetoes, 52 presidential vetoes. 21 of those 52 were over infrastructure bills. So beginning with Madison, who had his last act as president, he vetoed the bonus bill, which would have involved federal funding of infrastructure.
So do you think had they not been vetoed, I imagine they would have been challenged in the courts as unconstitutional?
Possibly,
is that right?
Yeah, but not all though. Like John Quincy Adams was a proponent of federal funding, and so there were some bills that didn't get vetoed during his time, and then afterward Jackson started vetoing them, and everybody leading up to Buchanan would veto them when they came along.
And that ended with Polk.
Buchanan was the last president to veto. He vetoed 2 infrastructure bills in 1860, early 1860. And then the Republicans, when they came in, who were kind of they were the offshoot of the Whigs, who were in favor of giving federal government this power. And when they came in 1860 with their campaign platform, asserted that the Constitution does allow funding of infrastructure to support industry, and that it should be subsidized. So this was a big divide, and it ran counter to the framers' decision, and the Confederate ran counter to the Southern states. They didn't want to subsidize this infrastructure.
They very much viewed it as, anti-agrarian and pro-industrial.
Yeah, it was this kind of crony capitalism, anti-free trade. So yeah, that's their mindset.
Then there was continued debate and push for these things, though, until and then it came to a head with the construction of the desired construction of the Panama Canal in the early 1900s under Teddy. Is that right?
That's right.
So Teddy Roosevelt wanted the U.S. to. What was the saga of the Panama Canal there? Because we didn't start with it, but we ended up, or the United States didn't start with it, but we ended up with it.
Yeah. So the developers of the Suez Canal, I think French investors saw the opportunity to develop the Panama Canal. It had been long discussed, and they came over and did that, and they couldn't make it work.
Much more difficult than the Suez Canal.
Yeah, it's I think the Suez Canal doesn't go up and down. It's just kind of straight across, and there's a lot of heavy terrain in that area of Panama. But the U.S. ended up purchasing the rights to develop the canal, and they did so. It was originally, Panama was part of Colombia, the country of Colombia, and there was an agreement, a treaty passed, I think the Hay Treaty, maybe the Hay Treaty, where the U.S. government was going to buy the rights from Colombia, and they negotiated the treaty, but the Colombia Senate balked. And so the Roosevelt administration, Teddy Roosevelt, orchestrated or supported a coup in which the country of Panama seceded from Colombia and formed their own government, and then we entered into an agreement with them.
Is that our first documented state-sponsored coup? Did we do earlier ones than that?
I don't know. I can't. That's a good question. Might have been.
Yeah. Okay. Different topic.
Yeah, but this ability to fund canal construction was challenged by this guy Wilson, for just an individual.
He was just a guy who was like, "Hey, that's the government's not supposed to do that.
Yeah, this isn't constitutional." So they sued the Leslie Shaw, who was the Secretary of the Treasury at the time, and wound its way through the court and up to the Supreme Court. In 1907, they ruled in favor of Shaw, and said that Congress has the ability to build infrastructure.
Yeah, and this was a time, this was kind of early in the time of the court where the prevailing view was, there's a term for it. I'll link to another podcast about this. But the prevailing view was that that the lawmakers should not be so constrained by the Constitution, and they should generally be more interested in sort of the will of the people kind of thing. And progressive era was very much of a time where it would be appropriate for big schemes, big federally funded schemes to be pursued. And whether or not those were to the letter or intent of the Constitution unconstitutional, that was less of an issue for them.
Yeah, and I think it gets back to what we were talking about earlier with the kind of economies of scale and centralization and bigger and better. Yeah. And there are several, I can't name them off the top of my head, but there were several Supreme Court decisions leading up to that Wilson v. Shaw decision that transformed, reinterpreted the Commerce Clause, and these are in the decades after the War of Northern Arrogance. So they shifted the whole Constitution.
Yeah.
To enable the government to be more involved and support industry. And
yeah, I can imagine at that time, like this giant war that was sort of devastating for the whole country, particularly the South, 1861-65, devastating for everyone. And you sort of emerge from that apocalypse in the same way that people emerge from a different apocalypse in World War I and sort of another thing, and like essentially nuclear war and World War II. And you're like, the world is different now. The old rules don't apply anymore. It's time for something new. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's out of that was out of that whole thing that a guy like Corbusier emerged, or Robert Moses emerged, and it's like we think differently now. Than the old way of thinking things is not a way to think anymore. We need an entirely new way.
Yeah, it probably comes down to hubris to a large degree, and we this kind of will to power. And like you say, ego, we can do anything we want, like the gods.
Yeah. Then, the Federal Reserve right after that. A lot of meaningful changes happen in that period that affect. Then, to go back to that. So now we can fund the canal, but it was right after that we, empowered by Wilson versus Shaw, the federal government got into the road building business.
Yeah, so you had Wilson versus Shaw in 1907, and then you had the Internal Revenue Act and Federal Reserve Act in 1913 that passed that provided huge sources of funding for the federal government to do things like fund wars and infrastructure. So shortly after that, you had the first Federal Road Act in 1916, which was also when the first zoning, Comprehensive Zoning Act in New York came about. Not much happened as a result of that 1916 Federal Road Act because we got into World War I. But then in 1921, they expanded it and allowed these matching funds for federal funds for the states. And along with the car was becoming increasingly popular. And through Ford's methods and others, it was reduced the price of the car, so everybody wanted one, and so there was this kind of people were agitating for more roads out to the countryside, and you had this kind of
popular support for it,
right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Do you remember that? What's that children's book that was written around this time about the steam shovel, the kind of anthropomorphized steam shovel? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And like he's the steam shovel, and he's going to build the road out and enable all these houses to be built way out there, and we just got to build the road. And he works on building the road.
Yeah, that reminds me back to Teddy Roosevelt. He was the first president to leave the country, and he did so as part of a PR tour to go tour the Panama Canal. And there's a famous picture of him in this kind of white suit with a white hat operating a steam shovel in the Panama Canal. And that took place right before the Supreme Court heard this case.
Yeah. It's campaigning for it. Mm-hmm. It is interesting, all these interests that have this trickle-down effect, or, the butterfly flaps its wings kind of thing. And then we have an enormous amount of sprawl and a giant machine built around it. A thing that I find that I think awareness is much greater now than it was about things, but I also find that there's the institutionalizing forces are so much more entrenched now. Like, though awareness is much greater, the work to be done to dismantle all this institutionalization is also much greater. So maybe we put that aside for a little bit. And I do want to ask, I think, when people imagine a real estate developer, if they imagine anything, like that could mean a great many different things to all kinds of people. Sure. And it is, like, it's totally different. It can mean many different things. But when people ask you what you do for a living, what do you tell them?
Well, I usually say that I'm a builder, or sometimes that I'm an aspiring artist. And that sometimes will lead to the question, well, what do you build? And so I'll talk about, I'll say something like, well, I'll build opportunity or build and renovate neighborhoods. So, yeah. Kind of vague.
Yeah.
But that usually prompts a conversation, a bigger conversation. So
you don't have a soundbite for people?
Not really.
Yeah. It's hard to describe.
But I think I do, and looking back at my career and building or civic art. I mean, we've been in business. We want to make a fair return on our investment. We're motivated by economic factors too, but we also want to build beauty, create beauty. And so it is much easier, as we talked about earlier, just to go out into the hinterlands and buy up land and put in the same old infrastructure and sell to production builders. But it's just like, I wouldn't want to do that. Much rather be involved with creating or helping to facilitate the creation of beauty.
Yeah.
And that's hard for people to understand because, people presuppose that, oh, you're a developer, you're just this kind of, you're just in it for the money. So
it's kind of like you need the money to do it. It's like you can't keep creating the cool things unless you make the money. That reminds me of a current jag I have. So I spent a lot of my career in software, and I used to be a big techno-utopian, I guess, like that technological innovation was broadly a force for good. And I still believe that innovation is a great and important force for good. But I do not, I think there's a lot of forces that are promoting technology for the sake of technology, and innovation for the sake of innovation, or what innovation means is really maybe something new that uses technology, whether or not it's actually useful, and been influenced a lot originally by someone I think you introduced me to, Ivan Illich, but kind of more people are writing about this now, about like, is technology really good for us? Or in what ways is technology good for us, and is it indiscriminately good for us? And I wonder what Steve Jobs, who was so ambitious and excited for the potential that the iPhone or the iPad was going to have for individuals, I wonder what he would think right now. Like, I think he would have been, as an artist, he would have been pushing in a big way to sort of change the direction people were taking with screens in their lives, long before Tim Cook, who I think is wanting to manufacture and extract as much wealth out of the profit of selling devices. I think that's really important to him, whereas Jobs was certainly commercial, but he was an artist. Where I was going with that, I was thinking about real estate development. It's similar to me that I feel like there's a lot of push in real estate development to build things without being discriminate about what we're building. And the things that are the things that the forces most support the building of, I think most people tend to not be all that discriminating, and so they're just building what's easy to build. And so we get more ugliness, we get more, popular opposition to the building of anything. And so it becomes harder to build something special that's not necessarily predictable or prescribed. And so that creates even more force for people to go build where the cows don't vote.
Right.
Because people are going to drive till they qualify.
Yeah, it's this vicious circle.
Yeah.
And it's hard to get out of, or it's the whole fish aren't aware of water thing. But again, I mean, if you, and we generally live in an ahistorical age, a lot of people.
What do you mean by that?
People are just unconcerned with history. You
think they're less concerned with history relative to prior ages?
Yeah. And then maybe a lot of that has to do with the hubris of today, and we're like the gods,
like high time preference too. There's maybe high time preference versus lower time preference.
Yeah, we don't think very far.
Yeah, this house is only going to last for 40 years. Why do I really care? It's not all that big a deal what we do. Or I'm going to buy this and throw it away. Or
yeah, that's right. It's not. It's not. probably has a lot to do with just cultural forces and consumerism and things like that too, where we're just all concerned about the here and now, and who dies with the most toys wins, that kind of baby boomer mindset that's been institutionalized in a lot of policies, and we still follow, even though, you can look to the evidence of the way we used to build versus the way we've built over the last 80 or 100 years. And what's going on? Why wouldn't we stop doing that?
That's where, so thinking about software technology and things where I'm struck with all this ambition and this kind of Daniel Burnham type, make no little plans, they have no magic instrument. Like these people who are like want to do really, really big things. They want to have big, successful things, but it's actually the success that the financial success they're pursuing. They actually don't. There doesn't seem to be a lot of regard for what they're building, like where they're investing their time and energy, and what's getting built. And I think they're investing toward things that they can get a return for themselves. But it does seem like there's a lot less regard for why. Why are you doing that? Like, why are you built? I recognize that there's a great profit opportunity in the building of this creation of this new business that's going to help extract more meaning from large data sets that you can then sell to, enterprise clients that are going to do things that are going to help the giant business be better at building the big business. But when you talk to when your great-grandchildren are asking you what you were doing, like, are you going to be all that proud of that work? Is that going to be all that exciting? There's not a lot of concern with, it seems like, I really don't want to disparage the desire to earn a living, because we all need to earn a living. But there seems to be less regard among especially ambitious builders, developers, entrepreneurs for why they're doing what they're doing. To what end? Why does this matter? Is the world really going to be better when you've raised your $45 million to do this project, or secured your financing to develop this piece of land the way you're wanting to do? Once you're done, is it really going to be better? I don't think there's a lot of regard for that.
No, and I think, brother, you're very good and eloquent about kind of describing this as a disparity, and we've both thought a lot about that, but it gets down to, meaning, meaningful work. So many of the people that you've interviewed, I think, you're looking for the people who are doing meaningful work and have a long-term horizon that goes well beyond their own lives, and that's countercultural.
Yeah,
still. Well, and as you mentioned,
you look at the success of the Yeoman podcast, that's got to be encouraging. We're now up to we're growing by single digits every month.
Well, speaking to the remnant, that's okay.
Yeah.
The remnant needs to hear you.
Yeah, this is not my highest and best skill, but I am getting good people.
That's fun.
Yeah.
It's I think the technology thing that you mentioned, it's technology for technology's sake. Technology can be great. It's like what we're doing here.
Totally.
But I think it really comes down to me. You mentioned Illich, Ivan Illich, who was I think very underappreciated person in urban design circles. So just read Energy Inequity or Deschooling Society or Medical Nemesis or any of his very short little books. They were provocative, but he talked about technology of a hammer or one's 2 feet, walking and being able to be in a walking environment versus this kind of dehumanizing technologies that we have. And we're going to get those, but do you subsidize them?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So, I do like my people think I'm a car hater. I don't hate cars. I have had cars, since I was 16. But I just don't like subsidizing the infrastructure for the car. people like sex and ice cream too. Doesn't mean you subsidize
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
So
you're just Illich talked about that as there were tools for conviviality, and then and those were the tools we had in our life that sort of helped make things better, and greater systems that we had that promoted community and promoted lives well lived. And then we have other tools that would probably be, I don't know if he went down this direction, but they would take root and have a place in our society, but absent enormous amount of subsidy, intervention, whatever, they would probably not play a big role in our lives. And on the car, like his big thing, how did he describe it? And I think maybe his math wasn't exactly right, but directionally correct. He was like, if you add up all the time that you spend working for the car, to have the car and to maintain the car, and then you apply that over the amount of time you're driving, your average speed is roughly equal to a brisk walk.
Right. That's he added up the amount of time you spent to work to afford the car, to drive the car, to
pay for your insurance,
all that stuff, and you read that in the 70s or something. But how many miles you get per year, and he divided the miles, whatever, 10,000 by the 6,000 hours or something that goes into. I can't remember the math either. It's a famous quote. We can look it up, but it's you're going like 7 miles per hour.
I like where another philosopher, super radical guy, Kevin Carson, who's living, this young guy, actually, he seems pretty young, isn't he?
He's probably about my age, so young.
He's pretty old. He took Illich a little bit further with that analogy. He was like, Illich, and further he went, his argument goes, I'll link to this. His thinking was without the subsidy of all the infrastructure that goes into cars and normalizes them and creates what Illich called a radical monopoly. It's not that a business had a monopoly, but a thing, like everyone was obligated to have a thing. And we are in a society now where you're obligated to have a car, essentially.
For most parts of the U.S.
Yeah, most parts of the U.S. If you do not have the luxury of choosing wherever you want to live, which most people don't, it's almost certainly the case that you're kind of obligated to have a car, which is a huge tax on people. But if we didn't have, Carson's argument was, if you didn't have all that infrastructure that went into it, cars would certainly be around, but it would be rare that a car would ever have to accelerate fast to get on the highway or to merge in lanes. So you'd have a different type of engine. It would likely mostly be for transporting goods over relatively small distances. So they'd probably be pretty small and small good transportation things. And he talked about the car system that we have as one of these big forces of atomization. It's a thing. I'll link to that.
The distorting how these subsidies distort the built environment. That is a good article to link to, that Foundation for Economic Education article.
Is that what it is? It's not Foundation for it's
Foundation for Economic Education.
Was that in Fee that he wrote that? Oh, I thought it was elsewhere. Okay, wherever it is, I'll link to it.
That's where it was originally published.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
He did not go in that article, though, into some of the things we've been talking about, the roots of that subsidy. He gave some of them, like the railroad and things like that. But
something I love about, and you've introduced me to a lot of these things, it makes us terrible dinner company for people who aren't interested in topics. But you are a great you're not a professional. You've told me before that you kind of had wished you'd studied earlier in your life more history. But you do a great job at digging through the actual history of where all these things come from. And I have found lately that whenever I'm looking at some modern ill of society, that if you really pull on enough strings, you're going to find it somehow is coming back to some sort of institutionalizing force of centralization or something like that.
I think Carson would argue that very well. He can give example after example.
Yeah.
Yeah, how the dots are connected. And I think that's why the awareness is so important. And some things, we would rather not talk about or just dismiss, or memory hole, rather than trying to get to the root of why things were, which I think is important to really understand. And I appreciate the compliment, Jeff. For me, I think I've been fortunate enough, to go to UVA and walk around Jefferson's grounds and the small town upbringing of our parents and been exposed to that. Even when our parents would bring us, I think you weren't around then, but the first time in Charleston was, when we were vacationing at Pawleys Island or something, and Mom and Dad would bring Tamara and Eric and me, drag us through the streets of Charleston in August.
Yeah.
It seemed horrible at the time, but it made an impression. And my first memories of Charleston are when we were at the city market, and Mom got caught in between these two women who were arguing over who had the best tomatoes. Back at the time where they actually sold produce in the market. But all these things have an impression, shape everybody has their own unique prism through which they view life, and it's shaped by experience and history. But a long way of saying, I think I've had the benefit of living in the Charleston area for so long and being exposed to the history and trying to connect the dots. This is one of the things that we dismiss. We kind of the common belief is the Civil War was fought over slavery, and certainly slavery played into that, the forces against one another. But so we kind of dismissed the whole Confederacy, but there were some things that I thought that were really good that they were trying to do, like these anti-crony capitalist laws, changing powers of Congress to preclude this, and that gets forgotten about.
So it's really unfortunate that because of the great terribleness of slavery, that it's not possible, it seems impossible to discuss the things that the aspects of the Confederacy that they were striving for, and I don't want to make any excuses for the terribleness of slavery. And also, they were essentially wanting to build, well, at least for white people, a free trade zone in the South to react against the emergent crony capitalist forces that were coming up in the industrializing North.
Yeah.
Seeing more clearly the terrible things that back in those debates over things like internal improvements that had happened 75 years ago, they were seeing more clearly the negative aspects of those things and wanting to build something, for white people, similar, that was better insulated against those bad things. Mm-hmm. And then, so you had the victory of the Union there, and just the steam rolling over all those different, that rich, those things that we ought to be paying attention to nowadays.
Well, and you're right. Not only did we kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater, the whole Confederacy, but arguably about the whole system of the way the U.S. was set up, with this kind of system subsidiarity.
Yeah, right.
The idea that government works best, most responsibly and responsively to the people it serves and needs it when it's closest to the people it serves and needs it addresses. That was largely not completely gone, but that took a real hit.
Yeah,
the centralization.
Totally. But I mean, the history is written by the victors, But it is a special thing about today that even when one group is writing the textbooks, there is still enough that that if you're curious, you can go out and find the real deal. And I am now less of a, used to be real starry-eyed about the American Revolution. But even that, like some of the things that you're describing about, financial interests, there were some financial reasons why.
Sure.
Why a lot of our founders very much wanted to break with the crown. Among them, that the king had said he was going to protect the interests of Native Americans west of the from the west of the Appalachians. And there were a lot of people who didn't want that to happen.
Right.
It's all kinds of crazy things that in history you dig enough. And
it's kind of it's geeky, but it's fun. At least for us.
I know
it is. About it.
So a couple closing questions. I want to ask you, what are you working on right now? What are the cool things you're excited about right now?
The big one, I with a business partner purchased an old manuscript library downtown that was originally built as a church, St. James Methodist Church, at the corner of Cumming and Spring Street, downtown Charleston, that we're in the design phase. It's a beautiful Greek revival structure, big grand temple form building, and it sits up on a high platform, and planning to do a restaurant and a few apartments on the ground floor of that facility above. But it's a landmark building in the neighborhood a few blocks away from my house downtown. So excited about that. Yeah, that's a beautiful building, and I'm excited for what y'all are going to do with that. Where are you? In what phase of development are you? In the design phase. Yeah. We have to get through the Charleston's Board of Architectural Review, so we're working on that. When did you first connect with the owner of that and start negotiating the purchase? She closed on the property 6 months or so ago. Yeah, last fall, I think it was 6 or 8 months ago. Mm-hmm. This was the property was owned by the Carpellas family. David Carpellas was a real estate mogul based in Los Angeles whose passion was historical manuscripts and also 19th century buildings. So he had purchased 14 of these old buildings in different cities around the country, and from which to display his historical manuscripts. And he had things like original copy of the Constitution, Gutenberg Bible, that level of collection. When he died a few years ago, his collection was valued at over $2 billion. And so his daughter and son inherited the property, and they've wanted to consolidate some of the collections and donate some of it and sell off some of it, and as well the buildings that were housing it. So I found out that they had sold older building in Jacksonville, and just reached out to the daughter and struck up a conversation and ended up negotiating a contract. Yeah, so that's exciting. It's great to see what the next iteration of that building will be, because it is a gorgeous building. That's going on. And, I know there are other things, but I also want to ask you what you're reading right now. I just finished a book. What's the name of it? The Demon of Unrest. Eric Larson. Yeah. Like a good Eric. Devil in the White City. Was it, so I like a lot of Eric Larson, and then sometimes, what's your review for that one? I liked it. I've only read The Devil in the White City. Oh, gotcha. And so this was only the second one. The story is roughly covers the period from Lincoln's election to the firing on Fort Sumter. Mm-hmm. And it's those 4-month period, of which a lot of high drama and intrigue about the positioning of what was going to happen to Fort Sumter. Mm-hmm. And So I'm just interested because it's in my backyard, but it's a really interesting story. I thought it was good, and he's a great writer, and it's well told, but he leaves a lot out.
Yeah.
So I think it's lacking in one respect, but it is. He did a good job with it.
Is it a tale of the area and the time plus a murder like Devil in the White City?
No, it's not.
No.
It's basically he just goes back and forth between what's happening with the Buchanan and then the Lincoln administration and their cabinet members and the Confederacy, and he focuses a lot on what's the guy's name? He was a fire eater who were the extremists in the Confederacy. The name escapes me right now, but also Mary Boykin Chestnut, who wrote a famous diary, and he just gets into the detail of these personalities, individual personalities, that was the things that were swirling around during that time period.
Always felt like the Low Country, particularly Beaufort and also Charleston, has really high character per capita.
Yeah, certainly does. High number of characters per capita.
That's what I mean. Yeah. Like a lot of big personalities relative to the number of people here. Maybe
yeah. What do you think that's partly due to the environment?
I think the heat, the proximity to the ocean. I honestly think the tidal marshes have a lot to do with that somehow. They're so rich and pungent, and it's just this thing that's always like if you're not here all the time. And when I lived here, it becomes like fish in water. But then when you go away and you come back, it really strikes you how much that affects you. I think. Did you read Overstory? That book. It's a good book it's a fiction, but it's about trees. It's sort of kind of hard science fiction about trees set in contemporary time. But among the things that they go into at great length is that the trees emit these pheromones that actually affect the way we think.
Wow.
And this whole idea of forest bathing is it's a real thing, but it's in part that you're in nature, but also there's trees are affecting our minds, the things, and they communicate with each other too. Like they can, if there's a beetle infestation on one side of a forest, trees on the other side of the forest will begin producing a chemical that will help insulate them from beetle infestation, stuff like that. But when you're down here and you can really smell the marsh, that there's all kinds of things that are floating, coming out of the marsh, and that pungent earthiness that affect the way people think. And then on top of that, the cultural diversity that's here. You've got, this whole enormous long history. And then you got ghosts on top of that that are affecting things.
Yeah, and you have, some of the most beautiful and serene landscapes that can turn violent too, hurricane and storm events. And I think that Charleston has something of a kind of a siege mentality here, a little bit, which is legitimate when you think about it, because Charleston has been under siege for a long time. And initially it was fear of the Spanish or indigenous Americans, and then the British, and then the Yankees, and then the, people moving in from up north and changing things.
Big box retailers.
Right. All that. And so there's kind of this back to this fear thing. There's a bit of a fear that I think there's a joke. How many Charlestonians does it take to change a light bulb? Change. So there's some of that, and there's some good things about that. But then we tend to get stuck. So, but it does. It's a wonderful place, and it's where I've decided to make my home.
Yeah, right. Well, I admire that about you as much as I sometimes give you a hard time. Like so many places would like so many. There are lots of places who want beautiful things built, and this is where you're doing them. Well, Vince, thanks for joining.
Yeah, thank you, brother. Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, where should we tell people to find you?
We have a website that is a little tired, needs updating, but you can go to lowkeysouth.com, LOCI South.com. Just see some of our projects, and or just Google me and find all the good stuff and bad stuff online.
There's a lot of both. All right. Well, thanks a lot for joining me.
Thank you, man. See you.